Dilip, in today's episode of In Conversation with Tibettv, we have a special guest. He is a former Indian diplomat, former public service administrator, and an author. He released his second book titled Imperial Games in Tibet, The Struggle for Statehood and Sovereignty last month. And right now, he's visiting Dharamshala and Central Tibetan Administration, and we are taking this opportunity to talk to him about his book on Tibet. Welcome to our program, Ambassador Dilip.
Thank you.
Congratulations on your new book. You have been an Indian government diplomat and ambassador in various countries for many years. And you have also been a public speaker on the issue of international security and Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and environmental diplomacy. So if I may ask you, can you tell me what made you write this book and why now?
Well, when I was in service, I did whatever work was assigned to me, and that gave me very little time for any kind of other activity. So it was only after retirement that I could start doing some academic work that I was interested in. And my first book was, of course, very closely related with what I was doing, which was on the Security Council. So that book was relatively easy for me. I was able to, since I had done the work while in service, I was able to get that book out of the way. But on Tibet, I was very keen to write a book because I did feel that there was a lacuna, something missing in the literature on this subject. And the subject that we were all focusing on when we dealt with the politics of India-China relations was focused very narrowly on the border issues and very little on the issue of Tibet itself. Because India, I realized, did not ever share a border with China. It shared a border with Tibet. And all through history, this was a very peaceful border. Neither Tibet nor India ever had any security concerns. So there were very few agreements. There was no need to have agreements to be signed on the border. So the whole frontier was open. People traveled, very few people traveled, but people traveled across, essentially some traders, some scholars of Buddhism who would travel, some other people would travel. So I felt that when this border was taken over by China and hostilities started, then just merely talking about the border was really not getting to the crux of the problem, which was India and Tibet and India's relations with Tibet. So it was important for us in India to understand Tibet, to understand India-Tibet relations, and then to come and try and understand what is happening now in our relations with China. So it was this idea of filling this gap in our knowledge that I wanted to work on and inform especially the younger generation today, because the older people have a reasonably good idea of what happened then, but they didn't have much knowledge of Tibet. It was, whatever knowledge we had was essentially of China and India and the border negotiations, and perhaps a little bit about how British India interacted with China. But now we have, I wanted to bring in Tibet into it and try and understand what was Tibet and how did Tibet reach this position where it completely vanished from India-China relations. So that was the motivation behind my writing this book.
So this book is for the Indian readers and for Tibetan as well, right? Because for Indian reader, it'll be they'll understand the whole issue and the conflict of Tibet better, and for Tibetan, I think it gives different perspectives. Someone from your side writing the whole historical background of Tibet, and which is something I think more than that we know, right?
Well, the book has been written essentially for the Indian reader. because I don't think I can claim to know enough about Tibet to be able to inform a Tibetan. But yes, the international politics, but my focus is not so much on the history of Tibet or the history of China for that matter, but on the international politics that played out in the 19th century and the early 20th century, which led to a situation in which the major powers started accepting Tibet as a part of China. And then after the Second World War, when the current configuration of countries emerged, then the rest of the world also accepted the view of those imperial powers that Tibet was a part of China, and therefore the invasion or intervention, whatever you call it, was essentially an eternal affair of China. So that aspect, I'm sure, will be of use of knowledge, would add to the knowledge of young Tibetans also. But the book is essentially meant for the Indian readers.
Ambassador, you have mentioned in the book that had Britain or Russia annexed Tibet at that time or earlier, instead of leaving Tibet in the Chinese Empire, Tibet would be a free country today. And I'd like to ask, why didn't Britain or Russia pay interest in Tibet when the two powers vied for the influence of Tibet so badly?
You see, the great game, which we are all familiar with, was a game played between Russia and Britain for control over Central Asia. And this was in the 19th century, and it came to an end sometime in the early part of the 20th century. So Tibet was part of Central Asia, and when Britain and Russia started playing this game, the Chinese Empire, which was the first empire to enter Central Asia and conquer places like East Turkestan and Tibet, had gone into decline. And because of the European invasions taking place on the coastline of China, China had become extremely weak. And both Russia and Britain were trying to gain control over Central Asia. But in their rivalry, both felt that when they came to a settlement in this region, they felt that they could not possibly take everything. So they divided the region between themselves. And certain parts they assigned and let them remain in the Chinese Empire. And Tibet was one of them. So when the agreement finally took place between Britain and Russia in 1907, it's called the Anglo-Russian Convention. In that convention, Chinese suzerainty over Tibet was recognized, and it was agreed that Tibet would remain, that neither Russia nor Britain would take any kind of concessions inside Tibet, and Britain only had some trading rights to open some trade marts in Tibet, but only for trade purposes. So politically, neither Russia nor Britain would enter Tibet. Now, this agreement, which came after the invasion of Young Husband in 1904, ensured that Tibet did not become a part of either the Russian Empire or the British Empire, but remained a part of the Chinese Empire. Now, this was very ironic because as things shaped up later on, the British Empire came to an end after the Second World War, and the Russian Empire, which had become the Soviet Union after the Russian Revolution, but essentially a continuation of the Russian Empire, that collapsed in 1990 when the Soviet Union broke up. So all the Central Asian republics became independent. But and Mongolia, which was a part at one time claimed by China, that had been taken by Russia under its sphere of influence. And so Mongolia also emerged as an independent country. But East Turkestan, which China called Xinjiang, and Tibet, which were assigned to the Chinese Empire, they were reconquered by China when the Communist Party came to power in China. And they became part of the People's Republic of China. But Britain and Russia both continued to accept that they were part of China. So the rest of the world followed suit and accepted that. So you had the very ironic situation that those parts of Central Asia which went to Russia and those which came to Britain, like Afghanistan, came to the British sphere of influence. But Afghanistan became independent, and so did the Central Asian republics, so did Mongolia. But East Turkestan and Tibet remained under the Chinese Empire, and then later on they were claimed by the People's Republic of China. So that was very ironic, and that's the irony that I have pointed out in the book.
China today, they have a ludicrous claim over Tibet, and also they have the policy, Sinicization policy in Tibet in place right now. So in your book, you have written about there's a little prospect of a smooth reincarnation. Could you elaborate on how do you see the matter panning out in the future?
Well, China, although it's a communist country, ironically claims that it has the right to appoint the Dalai Lama. And it also claims that historically the Dalai Lama has always been appointed by China, which is not really correct. But the claim is there, and one expects that when His Holiness passes away, China will definitely appoint its own Dalai Lama, which I doubt anybody will accept. But China, of course, will ensure that China at least accepts it, and it is enforced in Tibet. Now, we don't know where the reincarnation will take place and what instructions His Holiness will leave behind. But what the US law, for example, has stated very clearly is that this is a religious process, and therefore it must be left entirely to the religious community of Tibetans to decide how the process is going to take place. The Indian government has not made any statement on this, but one expects that India, being a secular country and doesn't interfere in religious matters, will not interfere in this process, and it will leave it to the religious community of the Tibetans to decide on the reincarnation. And that would be in accordance with the wishes of His Holiness.
So I'd like to ask, in what way the role of Central Tibetan Administration fit in and operate in the present day international politics scenario?
Well, Central Tibetan Administration organizes all the activities of the Tibetan community in exile, and it's a very difficult task because once a community lives in exile, then they have to live in different countries under different laws and different environments, and to preserve the culture they need a common point, and that is provided by the Central Tibetan Administration. And now that His Holiness has transferred all his temporal powers, all his political powers to the Central Tibetan Administration, now even the administration of all these matters is in the hands of the Central Tibetan Administration. And it is the CTA that will now have to lead the Tibetan community in exile, provide leadership to it so that the movement itself remains active and is able to promote the cause, not only protecting the Tibetan culture and identity, which is very important in this widespread diaspora, but also to ensure that the objectives that they have set themselves, which is to return to a Tibet which is whatever status they negotiate, that is also pursued, and that will have to be done by the Central Tibetan Administration because they are the authorized body in the Tibetan community now to do this, and also the interactions with the other governments of different countries also needs to be done by this Central Tibetan Administration. So it has a very important role in promoting the cause of the Tibetan community and the Tibetan people.
So, Ambassador, these are my questions for this interview. Thank you so much for taking out your time today to talk to us, to Tibettv today, and it's wonderful to see your book through which you have told the truth about Tibet as it is through your wonderful book. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
We would like to let our audience know that Ambassador Dilip Sinha will be speaking at the Tibet Festival that will be held at India International Center, New Delhi from 3rd to 5th September. Those interested can join the Tibet Festival.